At Ugarit's edge, beneath a sky cracked open by dust and fire, a scribe leaned over a clay tablet, his stylus trembling as he pressed into wet surface. The air tasted of a smoke and salt, of the sea that once brought wealth to the city, now choked with ash. He was recording not trade routes or royal decrees, but the final breaths of an empire already dying in silence. His hand faltered mid-sentence, a word half-formed, another erased under pressure from above. The palace had fallen. The walls were breached, not by siege, but by time and hunger. Far to the east, in a valley near the Tigris, a scribe's apprentice dropped his tablet into a fire. Not because he was angry, but because there was nothing left to write about. No king, no archive, no name for what had become of their world. The ink was still wet on the last record, a list of grain shipments, now empty. Somewhere in Anatolia, a woman stood at her hearth and stirred an iron pot with wood that once came from royal forests, now stripped bare by fire and war. In Cyprus, bronze workers hammered at nothing, tools too worn to shape anything but scrap, their forges cold. The same metal that had bound the world together was now being melted down for weapons in cities no one could name anymore. Trade routes were not just broken, they had dissolved into rumour, into nightmares of movement without direction. No single moment shattered this world. No battle cry rang louder than the silence after a child's first cry went unanswered in the morning. The collapse did not roar. It whispered through droughts that cracked farmland, through armies too large to feed themselves, through palaces whose granaries were empty and their record keepers gone. It was never 1 year of war or famine, but many years layered like sediment until every system failed at once. And when the final scribe looked up from his tablet, he saw not a future, but an end so quiet it felt almost peaceful. The year is long forgotten, but its shadow stretches across centuries, a time when empires stood like giants carved from stone and clay, their power measured in grain shipments, royal decrees, and the steady rhythm of trade routes that stitched together the Mediterranean world. This was not a single civilization, nor even one culture, but an intricate web. Mycenaeans in the Peloponnese, Hittites ruling from Anatolia's highlands, Egyptians cultivating the Nile's bounty, Assyrians pressing northward along the Tigris, and city-states like Ugarit clinging to Syria's coast. They spoke different tongues, worshipped different gods, yet all were bound by a shared economy. The Bronze Age international system. Ships carried copper from Cyprus and tin from distant Afghanistan, essential ingredients in making bronze, the metal of power. The palaces of kings ruled through vast bureaucracies, storing grain, organizing labor, and dispatching scribes to record every measure of wheat or oil. This was a world of interconnectedness, where a drought in one region could ripple into famine elsewhere, where a single invasion might unravel alliances spanning continents. The Mediterranean wasn't just a body of water, it was a highway, a marketplace, a stage for diplomacy and war. Coastal cities thrived on exchange. The wealth of the Levant flowed westward to Mycenaean Greece, while Egyptian pharaohs dispatched envoys across borders in search of alliances and raw materials. This vast network had flourished for centuries, built on trust, routine, and shared expectations. But beneath this order, unseen currents stirred, a slow shift in climate that dried farmland and withered harvests. The steady pressure of migrations from uncertain lands beyond the frontier, and a growing reliance on fragile trade routes that depended not just on peace, but on the continued stability of distant rulers. The system was not failing because one kingdom fell, but because so many across such vast distances were falling at once. In this moment, all threads began to snap simultaneously. The palace economies collapsed under their own weight. Cities burned and were abandoned in a wave that stretched from the Aegean to the Levant. And what had been civilization's greatest strength, its interconnectedness, became its fatal flaw. The collapse did not arrive in silence. Its echoes are written in stone, ash, and bone. Archaeological excavations across the eastern Mediterranean reveal a pattern. Cities abandoned, walls breached, palaces reduced to rubble, their storehouses empty of grain or oil, their archives scattered. In places like Ugarit, on Syria's coast, tablets were found half-burned beneath collapsed ceilings, letters pleading for aid from distant kings now lost, the ink still legible despite centuries of decay. These cuneiform records, preserved in clay, speak not only of war but of desperation. Grain shipments delayed, alliances fraying, gods unresponsive. Beyond writing, layers of soil tell their own story. In cities from Troy to Megiddo, archaeologists find sudden shifts, fortifications built where none existed before, then abandoned, cremation burials replacing elaborate tombs, abrupt drops in population density visible across survey grids. These changes are not subtle, they mark a systemic failure. The evidence isn't just material. Climate science offers another thread. Ice cores from Greenland show prolonged droughts during the 12th century BCE, while tree ring data confirms arid conditions across Anatolia and the Levant. Crops failed, water sources dwindled, radiocarbon dating of burned levels at sites like Megiddo or Alalak reveals a cluster of sudden destruction events, nearly simultaneous in time, suggesting not isolated conflicts, but coordinated pressure across multiple regions. Meanwhile, inscriptions on Egyptian temple walls depict enemy forces labelled as sea peoples, their names varied and shifting, Philistines, Jekka, Shardana, but always threatening. These were not vague myths. They appear with consistent frequency over decades, but the most revealing evidence is silence. Where once palace economies thrived on trade networks stretching from Anatolia to Egypt's Nile Delta, we find gaps in ceramic styles, metallurgical patterns, and administrative records. The breakdown of long-distance exchange of copper, tin, silver isn't inferred. It's visible in the absence of imports at sites that once received them. What remains is not a single cause, but a convergence. Climate stress, weakening states, migration pressing inward, war fracturing diplomacy, trade collapsing under its own weight. Together, these traces form a mosaic, not of one disaster, but of many failures aligned in time, revealing how fragile systems can be when their foundations are shared and vulnerable. In a village carved into the slopes of the Taurus Mountains, beneath a sky that no longer promised rain, a woman kneads dough with fingers cracked from cold and work. The flour is coarse now, mixed with barley, or ground acorns, because the granaries in the coastal cities are empty, their ships sunk or seized. She shapes flat loaves for her family, 3 children, an elderly mother, and sets them to bake on stones warmed by a fire that burns wood scavenged from fallen beams. There is no surplus to save, no extra grain tucked away for lean months. Near the fields, a man tills earth with a wooden plough, pulled by 2 thin oxen. The soil is tired, worn thin over generations of cultivation, and the crops fail in patches, barley stunted, vines shriveled. He has seen the dust storms come more often now, sweeping across the valley like warning breaths. Last year, the tax collector didn't come, No one knows if his palace was burned or fled inland with its gold. The scribes who once measured grain and land are gone. A boy walks to a nearby spring, carrying clay jars that used to hold olive oil from distant groves. Now they carry water drawn from a dwindling stream. He passes the ruined gate of what was once a walled settlement. The stones were taken for walls elsewhere, or left in piles like bones. The air is thick with silence, where voices used to rise at dawn. In homes built of sun-dried mud and reed, families huddle around hearths that flicker low. They speak less than before. Words feel dangerous when trade routes are closed, when strangers might be raiders or desperate refugees. Children learn to mend clothes with thread spun from flax they've grown themselves. There is no surplus for craft, no one left to buy fine garments. The stars above remain the same, but the world below has changed in ways too slow to notice until it's gone. A harvest failed, then another. An army passed through and took what wasn't hidden. The walls that once held back chaos now lie broken. And still they plant seeds when the soil allows, carry water when they can find it, keep fire alive, not because things are better, but because to stop would be to admit that nothing remains worth saving. The central dynamic, what made this collapse inevitable, almost cosmically fated, is the fragility of a system built on interdependence. For centuries, the Eastern Mediterranean had functioned as a vast, intricate web. Mycenaean palaces in Greece sent raw silver and olive oil to Egypt. Levantine ports traded copper ingots with Hittite envoys. Cypriot smiths refined ore for Aegean warriors who wore armour forged from Anatolian metal. This was not just trade, it was a network of mutual reliance, where the stability of one polity depended on the health of its neighbours. But that interdependence became its undoing. When climate shifted, droughts parched fields across Anatolia and Syria, withering harvests, the pressure built silently underground. Famine weakened kingdoms already strained by overextension. Then came the cracks, a cascade of events that fed upon one another. The Hittite capital fell not to siege, but to slow decay, its armies overstretched, its granaries emptying. As walls crumbled, refugees fled westward, pressing against Mycenaean borders. These migrations weren't invasions in the traditional sense. They were waves of desperation, driven by hunger and collapse. Warfare intensified, not between rival kings in a game of dominance, but as survival mechanisms for broken states. Armies fought not to conquer, but to survive, raiding granaries, sacking towns, burning fields, already half dead. The great palaces that had once regulated tribute, controlled trade routes, and managed labour through centralised bureaucracy now found their systems useless. No one paid taxes when the grain was gone. No one traded when roads were blocked by war bands or sea lanes patrolled by raiders. The collapse wasn't a single moment. It was a slow unravelling of trust, coordination, and infrastructure across 3 continents. When the last surviving palace records are written in cuneiform, when scribes scratch their final lines on clay tablets, the system is already dead. The economy has collapsed. Language begins to vanish from inscriptions. Cities lie abandoned beneath dust. The central dynamic remains a world that had grown too complex to sustain itself when its foundations failed simultaneously. Climate change, migration pressure, warfare, and the total failure of centralized control, all converging at once, not by design, but through consequence. The year that broke everything did not begin with a thunderclap, but with a slow gathering weight, like pressure beneath stone. Trade routes, once arteries of wealth and information, began to falter. Seals from Mycenaean palaces appeared in unexpected places: Cyprus, the Levant, even Anatolia, but without the goods they were meant to carry. The exchange network frayed at its edges. Cities that had thrived on export now faced empty granaries, their stored grain rotting as ships failed to arrive and markets dried up. In the hills of northern Mesopotamia, a child's bones lay buried beneath rubble. No tomb, no ritual. Nearby, ash layers showed signs of sudden fire, not from war but from abandoned hearths left unattended. In Egypt, inscriptions recorded foreign armies moving through the Levant with increasing frequency, their names shifting and unfamiliar. The Hittite capital, Hattusa, stood in ruins, its gates breached not by siege engines but by collapse. Walls leaning like tired men, stone cracked from heat and neglect. A pattern emerged across 3 continents. Coastal cities in Greece began to vanish overnight. Palace complexes that had stood for generations were abandoned without clear signs of battle. Not all fell at once, but the rhythm changed. The system no longer held together. It was not one war, but a cascade. Armies moving from multiple directions, some descending on centres already weakened by drought or famine. Climate records suggest decades of shifting rains and failed harvests, a dry period in Anatolia, a series of floods in the Nile Delta, dust storms across Syria. These were not isolated catastrophes, but converging stresses. The palaces had long relied on centralized storage, redistributive systems that worked only as long as surplus flowed from fields to courts. When drought struck and grain failed, there was no reserve, no safety net. And so the old order unravelled, not in a single event, but in the quiet moment when a scribe stopped recording rations because they had none to record, when a shepherd turned away from an abandoned settlement, not out of fear but indifference. The collapse was less a fall and more a slow letting go of systems that could no longer be sustained by people who no longer believed they were held together. What remains uncertain is less a single mystery than a constellation of unresolved questions, each shaped by fragmentary evidence and competing interpretations. We do not know precisely when or how often the palaces fell. Some cities vanished in silence, others were burned with unmistakable violence. But the timing varies too much across regions to suggest one grand moment of collapse. Was it a single cataclysmic year, as some have imagined? Perhaps. But more likely it was a slow unravelling over decades, punctuated by moments of disaster that left no clear trail in the archaeological record. The popular image of mass migrations swarming like locusts is compelling but misleading. We know people moved, truly, across Anatolia and into Greece, across the Levant and beyond. But we don't know how many, nor do we understand whether they were driven by desperation or opportunity. Were the Sea Peoples invaders, as ancient texts suggest? Or were they refugees caught in a tide of upheaval, themselves victims of forces larger than any single group? Climate data tells us that droughts intensified across much of the eastern Mediterranean, evidence drawn from lake sediments and tree rings, but we cannot be certain how those changes translated into famine or social unrest. The link between climate and collapse is plausible, but not definitive. And then there's the palace economy itself. Its fragility was central to the system failure, but we still debate whether it collapsed because of internal decay, corruption, inefficiency, or simply because external stresses overwhelmed it. The records from Ugarit and Hattusa show bureaucratic systems breaking down at different speeds. Some rulers sent messages pleading for grain or aid as if their world were already ending. Yet these letters also suggest they believed they could still negotiate survival. So the collapse was not inevitable, only likely. Finally, we must be cautious with metaphor. The Bronze Age wasn't a single civilization that fell. It was a network of interconnected societies, some thriving in ruins, others disappearing entirely. To speak of the fall as one event is to erase its complexity and diversity. We know the world changed, but not always how, nor why every place responded differently. That uncertainty remains vital. It reminds us that history does not follow tidy scripts, even when we want them to. The collapse did not arrive with a single thunderclap, but unfolded in layers, each crisis overlapping, each failure feeding the next, until systems that had endured for centuries could no longer hold. What endures is not just the fall of palaces or the silence of city walls, but the way it reveals how deeply interconnected human societies can be, and how fragile their stability when under pressure from multiple directions at once. The trade routes that once carried tin across continents now lay abandoned. Coastal cities, built on maritime exchange, were left to the wind and tide. Entire administrative systems, palaces with their granaries, scribes, tax records and tribute networks, simply stopped functioning. Not because of one disaster, but because each new strain weakened what remained. What lingers is not just the ruin, but the quiet persistence in the margins, farmers tending land without kings, families surviving by memory and tradition, communities rebuilding with older tools, slower rhythms. The great centres failed, but life did not cease. There was a reversion, not to chaos, but to something quieter, more local. People adapted, some through retreat into isolated hilltops, others by shifting from palace economies to kin-based networks. It was less destruction than transformation. The old order dissolved, and in its place emerged new patterns of survival. And it matters because we are still living within systems that balance on similar edges. The climate changes that shift harvests, the migrations driven not by choice but necessity, the collapse of trust in institutions, the fragile web of global trade. The Bronze Age didn't end because one people were bad or weak. It ended because conditions converged across time and space until no single power could hold it together. And yet, even as empires vanished, human life endured. We still carry that echo, not just of loss, but of resilience. Not in grand monuments, but in the quiet act of planting seeds when nothing else remains.